I'll admit, it took me a while to warm up to Susan. For starters, she wasn't a Korthak, but a human. You might think that sounds racist, but I was still just a cub then. Cubs don't deal well with changes, with things being too different. To make matters worse, I was just starting that awkward stage where my fur was changing and my glands were beginning to develop. So I was as obnoxious a little know-it-all wannabe adult as any Korthak girl at that age. Maybe worse. Looking back, I realized that the surest sign that my family truly loved me was that they didn't choke the life out of me, despite my best efforts. Susan was our new family maid. Housekeeper is probably a better word, or maybe live-in caretaker. We weren't the kind of rich family that requires servants for everything, but my father and all three mothers worked. Government jobs, and not the paid-to-sit-and-pick-your-whiskers kind either. The kind of mid-level administrator jobs that don't just stop at the end of the workday. The kind where they spent so much time making calls and answering communiques at home in the evenings that I sometimes wondered how they found the time to conceive me and my sisters. When you have that kind of schedule, having another adult in the house who can take care of the day-to-day stuff, the meals and childcare and such, can be a gift straight from the high gods. Susan, bless her, looked like anything but ascending from paradise. She was an air-breathing bipedal mammal and had a face, but that's about as far as her commonality with us Korthaks went. She was tall and narrow, nearly as furless as a newborn. No tail. Knees bent the wrong way. Only 2 arms, and those were weirdly proportioned, long and thick compared to ours. Glands high up on her chest and bulgy. 2 forward-facing predator eyes that should have been unsettling, but just seemed more goofy than anything else. Her mouth parts were kind of crude and not flexible enough, so she had a hard time with our language. She wasn't stupid, but her atrocious accent made her sound that way. That particular trait did not endear her to little know-it-all me. It didn't help that she was replacing dear old Ulanka, who had been with us since I was tiny, and I loved like an aunt. Still, Susan did everything she could to fit into the family and be liked. She was a conscientious housekeeper. She could cook Korthak food. She wasn't great at it. She couldn't whip up summer nut cakes from scratch like Ulanka had. I still miss those. But she kept us all adequately fed, and she did get better as time went on. She would go out of her way to talk or play with us. My sisters responded better to her overtures than I did, sad to say. I could be a sulky little thing. My haughty silences or curt dismissals never seemed to put her off much, though. "Miss Akiri, laundry is done," she would say. "Susan help hang up dresses?" "No." "Sure, is many dresses. Susan not mind." "Susan go mop floor. Akiri no need." I didn't usually mock her broken Korthan to her face, but sometimes I did. She would just nod, entirely unbothered. "Susan speak Korthan poorly, yes. Apologies. If Miss Akiri speaks Spanish, English, Druxite, or Hyzmotheric better than Susan speak Korthan, we'll use one of those instead." Her ability to occasionally put my snotty young self in my place failed to endear her to me as well. Still, despite her being an alien monstrosity and me being a little dunghole, Susan soon carved herself a place in the household. My father and middle mother liked that she took her duties so seriously, especially the childcare parts. My junior mother liked that Susan was physically strong and felt like she was tough enough to protect us children, should that unlikely need arise. And she probably was. I'd seen Susan move furniture and boxes around by herself that my father had to get other guys to help with. It was a little intimidating. My senior mother liked that Susan worked for cheap. She told me how much Susan got paid once. A Korthak wouldn't have worked a job as a professional nap taker for that much money. Ulanka had charged 3 times as much. I couldn't even imagine how messed up the human worlds must be if Susan was that eager to get away from them. My little sisters liked her because she always made time for them and took their questions and concerns seriously. And they were inquisitive way beyond the bounds of politeness. Why did so much of Susan not have fur, only her head? Did someone shave it off? Was there fur under her clothes that we couldn't see? Could we see it? Did she have more eyes? Why were the only two she had both in front? Didn't that make her easy to sneak up on? Do humans really eat dead animals? Did Susan eat them too? Here's a dead flutterbug. Does Susan want to eat it? What if we put shagroot sauce on it? The one Susan got closest to was my baby sister, Isanki, which was odd in its way, because Isanki was a skittish little thing. Just recently out of toddlerhood, Isanki had her share, and then some of the usual early childhood fears. Fear of the dark, fear of being alone, fear that monsters would get her. That last one was the big one with her. If there was a beastie or spook in Korthak child lore, my baby sister was afraid it was after her. Galactic Sickleteeth? He was waiting in the bathroom, ready to pounce, when she had to go potty at night. The Shade Eater? Gnawing at her shadow every time it touched the shadow of anything else. Father had to put extra lights in her room because of that one. Old Abanthy's severed hand? None of Isanki's blankets or bed dressings could dangle too near the floor, lest it climb them to get her. Even dumb movie monsters like the Whispering Worms or Vuthak the Dream Stealer terrorized poor Isanki. Why my parents let her watch scary movies, I'll never know. My suspicion is that it might have been some form of exposure therapy. Face your fears to overcome them, and all that stuff. If so, it was possibly the worst idea they'd ever had. Isanki didn't toughen up from exposure to more monsters. On the contrary, she just found more and more things to be afraid of. Sad to admit it, but it got to the point where I no longer even felt sorry for Isanki, just annoyed. Some of it was loss of sleep from her nightly bouts of unreasoning fear waking up the whole house. But another bit of it, a small bit, was because I wasn't all that many years removed from bogeyman fears myself, and Isanki's terror brought them back to me. And how could I be practically a grown adult and totally not a cub anymore if I still felt the urge to check behind the door for Galactic Sickleteeth before I went to bed? Ulanka had always tried to soothe and reason Isanki out of her fear of monsters, one of the few household jobs that she had completely failed at. When Susan came into the picture, she took a very different approach. "Monsters very scary, yes, Miss Isanki?" "Uh-huh." Susan had smiled, opening her lips to show her sharp carnivore teeth. She sat on the edge of Isanki's bed as she tucked her in and reached out to stroke my sister's head fur. "But Susan is scary too, yes? Grr! You do look scary and weird," Isanki had agreed. "But you're nice." "Oh, but Susan is scary. Big scary alien monster from space. But Susan is Miss Isanki's scary monster. Other monsters want to get Miss Isanki." She thumped a fist against her chest. "Must fight space monster Susan first! Rawr!" And then she had checked under the bed, and behind the furniture, and in all the dark spots for monsters, like we always had to do when putting Isanki to bed. But instead of an exasperated, "See, there's nothing," like we always did, Susan kept up a chant of, "Monsters run," or "Come out fighting, because Susan pound to bits if catch," and she would brandish a fist as she searched out each potential monster lair, as though she really was prepared to administer a beatdown on something hiding in the dark. Ridiculous, but it seemed to help, at least a little. Isanki's fears didn't go away, but they eased up enough that the household was able to get more sleep. For a while. Then some kid at school told Isanki that stupid legend about the chewing ghosts of Rakfa Valley. Isanki was a complete hysterical mess when bedtime came that night. I was thoroughly in my Little Miss Logical phase at that time, so I tried reasoning with her. Not that the chewing ghosts didn't exist, because there was no convincing Isanki that such boogaboos weren't real, but that Rakfa Valley was halfway across the continent, up in the Arctic, beyond two big mountain ranges. Even if they did exist, they couldn't get to... "They move through things!" Isanki squealed. "They can go right through the mountains! But it's so far away! Ghosts don't get tired, Akiri!" Yeah, I had no real argument for that. Then Susan had stepped in, flashing her mouthful of sharp white teeth and saying, "Has Mrs. Sankey forget? Space monster Susan is guarding. Other monsters no get past." She pounded her fist into her other hand to demonstrate what she would do to them. But for once, that didn't work on Isanki. "You can't fight off chewing ghosts. Bosric told me all about them. They just go right through everything until they're close enough, and then they start chewing on you." I just sighed and made a mental note to have a talk with this Bosric kid, to make sure he understood that sleepless nights in our household would be repaid to him in full on the playgrounds when the instructors weren't watching. Susan, as always, took a different approach. "Oh," she said, nodding sagely. "Is that kind of monster? Evil spirit type?" "Very true. No can fight evil spirit with just hands." Isanki just squeaked out, "I know, right?" and pulled her covers up to just below her eyes. She was shivering so badly, I could hear her teeth rattle like dice in a cup. But Susan had an answer for that, too. She rolled up her sleeve. She always wore full-sleeved garments and never showed the skin above her wrists, revealing a design drawn on her forearm. It was a simple geometric symbol made of two intersecting lines, with several rows of some incomprehensible alien script written underneath. "See?" she asked. "Is symbol and words from God of Susan's homeworld. Very holy, very magic, much power against monsters. Spirit monsters no stand against holy magic." Isanki lowered her blanket a little to get a better look. Does that stuff really work against ghosts? Against chewing ghosts?" "Of course. Susan is scary space monster, but no is liar. Most monsters beat up with fists. Spirit monsters beat up with power of Holy Spirit, delivered by fists." She clenched her right hand, the play of muscles rippling the symbol inked on her skin. Looking at it, I wondered how she could have known ahead of time to draw such a thing on her body to soothe Isanki with. Susan wasn't as dumb as she sounded, I well knew. But was she that smart? And then I looked closer and realized that the Holy Spirit stuff was not just drawn on the surface of her bare skin, but somehow was embedded into the flesh, permanently. This was something she'd had for a long time. But of course, I was still the bratty know-it-all, and just had to chime in with some logic, even if doing so would be counterproductive. "That's nice," I said, "but I doubt that holy words from some distant foreign planet would mean much to a Korthan ghost monster." But Susan took no more offense to that than she did about any other jerky comment of mine. She merely smiled and explained as she tugged her sleeve back into place. "Holy words not have power because monsters believe. Have power because Susan believe." It all sounded pretty silly to me, but Isanki appeared to buy it and was eventually able to calm down and go to sleep after a very thorough anti-monster patrol by Susan, who made sure to repeat the alien holy words written on her arm the entire time. An anti-ghost incantation, I guess. And when Isanki did not get chewed on by any ghost that night, Susan's already substantial stock went up immeasurably in my sister's eyes. Soon, we weren't even having to do nightly monster checks to get her to go to bed. A quick scan every few days was fine, as long as Susan was the one doing them. And as long as every night, before she turned out Isanki's light, Susan stood in the middle of the room and issued her warning. And that warning was always exactly the same, sort of a ritual between Susan and Isanki. Susan would stand with those weirdly long, thick arms folded across her chest. She would glare around the room, expression stern, bordering on grim, never smiling or giving any indication that she was not in absolute earnest. She would then announce to any spirits or bogey beasties that might be listening, "Little Korthak girl Isanki is guarded by space monster Susan Ortiz. Any other scary thing want to get little girl, come out and face Susan now." Then she would wait a few seconds, and when there was, of course, no response, she would curl her lip and say loudly, "Yes," is what Susan thought. Then a flash of those sharp teeth and a gentle, "Good night, Mrs. Sankey," always answered by a soft, relieved, "Good night, Susan." Legends say that rituals could be used to achieve power over monsters, and I suppose this one did just that, in a way. Things got better for a while, and then they got strange. Ikani, my middle sister, began accusing me of sneaking into her room and using her things. She claimed that she would find her toys or clothes moved from where she'd left them. Trinkets and knickknacks that were normally right here on her shelf moved to right there, instead. She usually noticed these things in the morning, but sometimes when she went to her room after school, which was of course preposterous. Because what would I, who was for all intents and purposes practically a fully grown-up adult since I had just started puberty and all, want with a bunch of little cubs' toys? There was less than 2 years difference in our ages. I said I was an insufferable little dunghole back then, didn't I? She accused me of trying to prank her, something I had never done, and considered beneath my august dignity as an adult Korthak. She then accused Isanki of being the sneaky stuff mover, which was even more preposterous because Isanki was too little to even reach the shelf that Ikani was talking about, not without getting a chair or something to stand on. And even as heavy a sleeper as Ikani was, she was the only one to sleep through Isanki's late-night monster terrors, would wake at the sound of a little kid moving a chair around right next to her bed. Since our parents had never made a habit of entering our rooms at night, unless something was wrong, that left Susan as Ikani's sole remaining suspect, which, in a way, was sensible enough. Susan cleaned the house as part of her duties. Presumably, she was moving the stuff around when she was straightening up. But no, Ikani had been in the room while Susan was cleaning before, and Susan always put things back where they belonged. Fine then. If Susan always put things back when she was cleaning, why would she move them around at other times? Plus, Susan was so conscientious and considerate, it just didn't seem like a thing she would do. Just to be sure, Ikani had asked Susan point blank if she ever worked in the bedrooms at night, which met with an emphatic, "Not ever. Silly to do in sleeping time. Bumble around, wake up children. Children need sleep. Susan needs sleep too." As for the possibility of Susan pranking her, Isanki and I shot that right down. While I might not like her nearly as much as I had loved good old Ulanka, I respected that Susan was an adult, and proper adults didn't prank children like that. For Isanki's part, Susan is a space monster, but she isn't a liar. If Susan said it wasn't her, then it wasn't, and that was that. Personally, I thought it was all in Ikani's head. Girls her age often loved drama after all, as opposed to us grown adult women in middle school who were beyond such things. How I laugh to type that now. Still, Ikani and I had had our share of sibling conflicts in the past. Recent past, to be honest. and I felt like this was just her way of either trying to land a little slap on me, or maybe grab some attention for herself. Or that, just as likely, she was just imagining the whole thing. And being the older sister, I wasn't at all afraid to tell her as much. You can guess what Isanki's take on the whole issue was. "A monster! A monster is sneaking into your room, Akane. I thought Susan had scared off all the monsters." I just had to make that snotty comment. Had to. Isanki just looked at me like I was the dumbest older sibling in Korthok history. "She chased the monsters away from me, Akiri. You two are still fair game." There was a maintenance hatch in the back of Akane's clothes closet. It was a little half-sized door that always stayed locked, behind which was the space between rooms where the plumbing and power and such for the children's suite ran. I had seen it open one time when I was little, before Isanki was born, and workers had been remodeling to add on what would become Isanki's bedroom. I remembered that hidden space being long and cramped and dark and full of pipes and dead bugs. Isanki thought that it sounded like an ideal monster lair, dark and still and easily forgotten. Pure little cub stuff, that. I didn't think much more about it until a couple of days later, when Akane came to breakfast, looking pale and droopy-whiskered. We couldn't coax an answer out of her while our parents were there, because there are some things that are just matters between the kids of a household. But when Isanki and I got her alone, Akane stammered out that she hadn't trusted us when we denied coming into her room. So, she had taken the step of putting a stool against her door with her slap bells from music class on it before she had gone to sleep. That way, whoever came into her room at night would knock it over, waking her up so she could catch the culprit dirty-whiskered. Only, nobody had done any such thing, and when she had woken up this morning, everything was normal in her room. Except, "The dresses in my closet," she hissed. "I hung them up all spaced evenly from each other, but this morning there was a gap." She held up 2 fingers. "About this far apart, right in the middle." "The monster did it," Isanki squealed. I remained unmoved. "Uh-huh, and how far apart were the other dresses?" Akane scowled at me, but narrowed the gap between her fingers by about 1/3. "Wow," I said, laying on the sarcasm. "A whole inch. That totally couldn't have happened due to absent-mindedness, or from you closing the door. It just has to be Galactic teeth frolicking through your closet." "Oh, go bite your tail, Akiri! I know what I saw!" Isanki cut off our argument before it could get going. "We have to tell Susan. She has monster magic to beat it up and make it go away." I started to scoff at the idea of pestering our housekeeper about this, but stopped when it hit me that this was actually an excellent idea. Susan's ritual antics with Isanki, cringe-inducing though I found them, had done wonders at reducing Isanki's irrational fears to a manageable level. Now that those phobias were beginning to infect my other sister, why not apply the same proven cure? "That's a fine idea," I agreed. "I'll talk to Susan and we'll have her do a monster hunt through Akane's room this evening after school." And so I made sure to catch Susan alone first thing after school and let her know what needed to happen. "Hey, Susan, I need a little favor from you." She turned oddly shiny and focused brown eyes on me and said, "Of course. What's Susan do for Miss Akiri?" Usually, Susan's weird predator eyes didn't bother me. They just seemed silly and awkward with their restricted range of view. But sometimes there would be an energy, an intensity about them that was just unsettling. Sure, she was a strange-looking creature from another world, but it was only in those moments of intensity that she seemed really alien. Regardless, she was still Susan, our family's housekeeper and caretaker. "I need your help with something," I told her. I then explained what had been going on, and how Isanki's fears of monsters and nighttime creepies were spreading to Akane, and how it was starting to affect her.
So I want you to do that monster-searching mumbo-jumbo that you do with Isanki, but in Akane's room, and go all out with it. Be really theatrical. Put on such a good show that Akane will never even think about monster nonsense again.
There was something deep in Susan's eyes as I said this. That weird intensity, but also amusement? A little sparkle of irony, perhaps? For just a second, she seemed truly, truly foreign. But then it was gone, and there was only the soft earnestness we had gotten used to. Of course, Miss Akiri. Susan make good show. Susan take care of everything. There was an agreement, unspoken but real, between us children, and Susan not to involve our parents in any of this. We didn't get involved in their going to work and paying taxes and bills, so they needn't concern themselves with this business. So, Susan came to Akane's room later that evening, around twilight, but well before our parents should be home. Supper was prepared, and in the warmer box, the house was clean, and the laundry done. There was nothing else requiring her attention but us. I know I had told her to make a show of it, but I didn't expect what we got. Rather than her usual work clothes, which were just traditional Korthak housekeeper's tunic and smock ensembles modified for humans, she had on what I assumed was one of her personal outfits. I'd never seen her dressed like that before. Pants with lots of pockets, a sleeveless shirt that molded tightly to her furless body, showing the lines of trim muscles underneath. The long black fur on her head, which usually swung loose around her shoulders, was bound behind her in a severe-looking tail. But it was her arms that really caught all of our, attention. The so-called holy design she had showed us before was just one of many such pictures and words inked into her skin. They filled almost all of her flesh between wrist and shoulder. There were other words in what looked like the same script here and there, colorful designs of things I didn't understand, pictures of things I'd never seen and couldn't understand. And there were a few, not many, but a few, that I thought I might recognize, but made no sense to me. An eyeball in the middle of a geometric design, a pair of knives with blades crossing one another, a gape-mouthed skull that was presumably human. My sisters were full of questions about them, because of course they were. Not me. I was curious, though. Not curious enough to be rude and immature, but curious enough to not prevent my sisters from being rude and immature. But all Susan would say was, before Susan was Miss Isanki's scary monster, was scary monster for other people far away. And that's all she would say about it, because we had business to attend to. I had expected her to do her usual routine of poking into all the corners and dark spots while calling out any monsters. I had told her to be theatrical after all. But instead, she just went to Akane's closet and moved the hung-up clothes out of the way, revealing the little half door. She rubbed her chin as she looked at it, then nodded. "Yes," she said, as though she was giving it serious thought. "If monster around is logical place for lair." She looked back at us. "Children, no worry. Susan take care of everything." Then she shooed us back. "Stay over by bed and let Susan handle." I took my sisters by their upper hands and led them back as she had asked. Inside, though, I was scowling. This was not how I had expected this to go. Where was the bravado and theatrics, the fancy rituals to ease my sisters' minds? There was one, of sorts. Susan was wearing a 2-line symbol on a cord around her neck, just like the one inked into her arm. She touched it to her lips, then put her hands together and mumbled what I assumed was a prayer in her own language. Some of it sounded like the holy words she said in Isanki's room, but only some. Then she stuck something into the waistband of her pants, a kitchen knife and some rags. Susan? What are... Just in case, Miss Akiri, just in case. She closed one eye at me, just for a second. I have no idea what that meant, if anything, but it felt conspiratorial. Then she unlocked the maintenance half door and went in, having to crouch all the way to her knees to fit through, before standing up again, once inside. And then... Ugh! Many dead bugs! Susan have to remember to clean here sometimes. But are there any monsters? Isanki demanded, squeezing my hand hard enough to hurt. No sea monster yet. Passage go back a ways and make corner. Deepest place is best for monster. We could only see Susan's legs and hips through the half door as she squeezed deeper into the space. It was made for Korthak workmen to get into, and Susan was narrower than that. But she was also much taller than a Korthak, and the space was full of crisscrossing pipes and conduits. "Do you want a flashlight?" I asked, sensibly, because I was such a sensible little grown-up, and knew that there would be all kinds of things to trip or get snagged on in there. "No light," she answered immediately. "Monsters run away from..." "But that's good, right?" Isanki squeaked. "We want monsters to run away." Most times, yes. Susan's voice was a little muffled by the walls, even though she wasn't that far away. "But monster come back later when no light. This time, no want monster running. If run, Susan no can kill. But if monster stand and try fight..." And then she laughed. And not her usual polite little reassuring chuckle, but a low, staccato sound that made something deep in my brain perk its ears up and go on the alert. The sound of danger, of a predator waiting to strike. We couldn't make out the shape of Susan's legs anymore as she went deeper into the dark. "Turning corner," she announced, and we could hear some bumping and scraping in the walls as she made her way through. "Much darker back, Hemar GPH." "Susan!" All three of us yelled her name as her voice descended to a surprised-sounding, muffled grunt. And then the walls shook as something was rammed into it once, twice, a third time. It sounded like our human housekeeper was having some kind of seizure in there. And she didn't answer us. There was just a pained-sounding grunting, more animal than sapient. Ikani screamed, "Oh gods! Oh gods!" and made the signs of supplication with her lower hands. "The monsters got her!" Isanki shrieked, wide-eyed and frozen with terror. I was frozen too, at least for the moment. Never mind the monster nonsense. Susan might be getting electrocuted or something up in there. But what to do? I could go in after her, but knew I was nowhere near strong enough to move her on my own if she was injured. And if she was getting shocked on a power line, touching her would just shock me too. We learned that in domestic safety class. I could call emergency services, but by the time they got here... And then there were words again. Not ones we recognized, but a stream of rapid-fire, incomprehensible syllables delivered in a tone that suggested profanity. But most importantly, it was Susan's voice saying them. They were accompanied by a series of hard, sharp impacts that I could feel coming through the floor and into my feet. "Susan!" I called again. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" I started for the half door. "Children, stay back!" she responded, a snap in her voice that stopped me in my tracks. "Was ambush!" Those impacts against the floor never stopped as she spoke, hammering and hammering like a piston in a machine. Isanki grabbed my lower hand and hauled on it hard enough to turn me around, despite our size difference. "There was a monster, Akiri!" she cried. "There was a monster, and Susan is fighting it!" Susan yelped suddenly. There was a flurry of scrabbling and scuffling from inside the wall space, then a wordless but triumphant-sounding shout, and the pistoning impacts began again. "Ha!" she called. "Stupid Cabron Korthak bogeyman sneaky, but no match for power of El Cristo Rey!" And the hammering against the floor went on and on. It was a couple of minutes before Susan came back out of the maintenance space, a little dusty and bedraggled, but showing us her teeth. To say we were dumbstruck would be kind of an understatement. Even I, little Miss Knows Everything, had no words. She came out of that little entryway and stood there in Akani's closet like some conquering beast. Her eyes met mine, and that weird alien sharpness was in them as she pointed a finger at me and motioned for me to come to her. I'll admit that the sight of her in that moment made me nervous, but the idea of disobeying her right then made me even more nervous. So, come to her I did. And as I stood before her in all her battle-worn glory, she leaned down and whispered in my ear, "Was good show? Was theatrical enough?" "Oh? Oh. Oh!" I tried not to let my relief show too plainly as it hit home just what she had done. I had just expected more of her worn-away evil spirit's antics, but she had gone straight to acting out a monster killing. I knew Susan was not as dumb as her accent made her sound, but I had no idea just how devious she could be. But it was in a good cause, the proof of which stood behind me, holding hands and eyes shining with awe. You really fought and killed a monster," Akani breathed. "I wouldn't believe it if I hadn't been here for it." She plopped down on her butt, right there on the floor. "Of course she did!" Isanki's 4 eyes were bright with hero worship. "Susan is a scary space monster, but she isn't a liar!" Susan locked up the maintenance way door behind her and pocketed the key. "Is so," she said. "Susan makes sure is no more monster in house, so children no be afraid." She nonchalantly started arranging Akani's clothes back on their hangers. "Now, parents be home soon, so children go wash for supper. Susan needs change clothes and wash up too." I think it's a quirk of the childhood mind to be able to switch so quickly and immediately between the fantastical and the mundane. My sisters, despite having seen what they assumed was a battle against a supernatural evil in their bedroom closet, unhesitatingly nodded their agreement and scampered off to the suite's washroom, happy and giggling, and discussing how much savor-leaf casserole they were going to snarf down. Susan watched them go, brown eyes soft and warm again, her smile no longer showing teeth. She was rubbing a rag over her right hand, the knuckles of which I only then noticed were covered in blood. She'd been punching the floor in there, over and over, like a machine. Of course she had damaged her knuckles, hurting herself for my sister's sake, for our sake, shedding her own blood for us. It looked just like Korthak blood, showing that, despite her being a giant alien monstrosity, Susan was really not that different from me inside. It wasn't the sort of thing I would normally say, but it felt like I needed to say it, like an adult would say in this situation. So, I tried. That was very well done, Susan. Well acted. An excellent show. Above and beyond anything I expected." She just nodded. "Of course, Miss Akiri. Susan is for help, and always glad to do." It was still so hard to say, but I was going to. Because I was a mature Korthak, and that's what mature Korthaks did. So, there was a brief flash of guilty anger at myself for betraying my memories of Ulanka this way, but I powered over that with the gratitude I felt. Thank you, Susan. Thank you very much for everything you've done with my sisters and their crazy phobia issues. There! I'd said it! And having done so, I somehow felt a little bit lighter inside, a little better, a little more, dare I say, grown up. Of course, Susan repeated, nodding again. And Miss Akiri very welcome. Now go wash up. We hurry. Parents home soon and then supper. And that would have been that. Things improved in the household pretty much across the board after that day. Isanki had way fewer night terrors and fear issues, although she still had to have Susan tuck her in and warn all the monsters away. Akani and I started getting along better, and I was just generally less of a little dunghole. Not a dunghole, because I was still a snotty pubescent Korthak girl, but a lot more tolerable. The decreased household drama lightened my father and mother's moods, and everything was just generally better in a real but non-tangible sort of way. So, as I said, that would have been that. Except, a few weeks after Susan's monster battle in the maintenance way, I happened to be in the kitchen while she was preparing supper. She'd been chopping sugar leaf stalks, and the knife had slipped and sliced her hand open. Not badly. Nothing that would require stitches or a trip to a medi-hall. Just a nick, really. Just enough that it bled a little bit before she could slap a stick tight over the cut and get back to work. Susan's blood had been red, iron red. What was all over her knuckles when she had come out of that maintenance way had been the normal dark green of Korthak blood. Maybe it was part of the show. An added bit of realism to sell the idea that she really had fought a bogeyman in there. Maybe she had taken some fake green blood and hidden in one of those many pockets on her pants and smeared it on herself before she came out. I had asked for theatrics, after all. Or maybe she hadn't done that at all. I could ask her, I suppose, what she really did in that dark, dusty space between the walls. I don't think I want to, because I'm kind of afraid of the answer, and we've had more than enough fear around this place. Thank you very much. But I do have a strong suspicion in spite of myself. Because ever since I saw Susan's red blood and made that connection, one thought repeats itself over and over in my brain. Susan is scary space monster, but No is liar,